All right, it is July 29th, and earlier this week, Google decided to give third party cookies a reprieve. However, that's not going to stop us from in our industry having to look to new solutions. A key component may be this company called Neutronian, which I'll explain in a minute quite what they do, and we'll get into that as part of our conversation. So let's kick it off, and let's start off with a new episode of Beeler.Cast. Hey, Lisa and George, welcome to the podcast. Looking forward to this conversation. I want you to introduce yourselves. Before I do that, I wanted to kind of quickly tell everyone why we're having this conversation. I was doing something I think is rare in our industry. I was actually reading some of the specs from the IAB Tech Lab, and they made reference to this company, Neutronian. And I figured as much as I'm focused on all things about seller defined audiences, and I know it's a key conversation that a lot of people are trying to figure out, it referenced this company that I hadn't really heard talked about in my circles. And the more I looked into what you do, it occurred to me that it's really key that we understand how we look at data providers, publishers who want to become data providers, that we start to actually understand some of this stuff because buyers are not going to buy things just because we say it's good. And I think that there's just an underlying aspect of that that is key. But before we get into the conversation itself about the company, let's talk about who we have as our guest. So, Lisa, can you introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about your background?
Sure. Yes. Thanks, Rob. I'm so happy to be here. Excited to talk to all your listeners. So I'm Lisa Abousaleh, Chief Customer Officer and co-founder of Neutronian. And at Neutronian, I'm really the point of contact that helps all of our customers, from publishers to third-party data providers, agencies, you name it, um, facilitate our solutions for them. I also moonlight as our marketing director, so doing corporate marketing, partner marketing. As with a startup, you wear many hats. Prior to Neutronian, though, I was at ComScore for a good number of years, and my last role there was heading up the ad platform partnerships team. So I know firsthand what it's like to be someone that has a data asset that you're trying to monetize, whether it's first party, third party, what have you. But making that available in the programmatic ecosystem, and kind of some of the hurdles and challenges that go about doing that, and then differentiating yourself and actually seeing revenue coming from those audiences.
That's great, and we will use your subject matter expert level on the data side, that history, as well as the fact that you wear many hats. I have a feeling we'll tap into all of those pieces. George, you know publishers. Again, you and I go back a little bit. Can you talk a little bit about what your role is and what you're focused on?
Yeah, definitely, Rob. Thank you for having me on the podcast. Good to see everybody. So I think you all probably know me in the context of the head of sales at Ad Lightning. I have been helping Neutronian in an advisory capacity. And, really what attracted me to Neutronian was the space that they're operating in. So I've been selling to publishers various solutions for the past, call it 7 years. I have been watching closely the actions of Apple, Google, et cetera. And then separately, have been kind of, very cognizant of the challenges that publishers do have. So I've known Lisa for some bit. I know her co-founder, Timur, and I kind of got interested in Neutronian both from the context of what they're doing to help elevate publisher first-party data, which in my opinion is super critical. Separately, what attracted me to the company was my previous, long ago, don't ask me when, background in finance when I worked in structured finance in Citigroup. And I was involved in a group that dealt with highly structured investments. So think back 2006, 2008, everything from mortgages to automotive leases. What attracted me to Neutronian was that space obviously required regulation, and you kind of had that in the concept of S&P and Moody's. It was broken due to several kind of layers of moral hazard. So I think the final kind of bow to tie this all together is that we're all operating essentially in an unregulated advertising market at the moment. So enter Neutronian to kind of help add some clarity and some assurance to the buy side. So that's why I'm excited. And I think Lisa and I have gotten to know each other quite well over the past few months, right, Lisa?
Absolutely. Yep.
Well, you make me think that, like, with that financial reference, is that for ad tech, we probably need to do a version of like The Big Short, which is one of my favorite go-to like movies, and we just have to integrate some celebrities who try to explain kind of like, what is a vast tag, and like have, we'll get Harry
Yeah.
Styles to do that or something like that. So we'll make a mental note that we need to do that. George kind of set up his interest in the in the companies based on what you do. Lisa, why don't you again talk about what it is that Neutronian does? Why don't you give us a good picture on that part?
Sure. Yep. So the quick way that we describe ourselves is we are the credit score for data buying. So similar to how you would have a bond rating, from Standard & Poor's or Moody's to help you evaluate financial decisions, we're a quantitative approach and qualitative, but approach to help you understand what it is that you're truly buying when you're making decisions on data to use for marketing and advertising. So I think there's obviously advantages to those that are buying data for having the standardization and a way to make those evaluations. But for anyone that's looking to sell data themselves, to be able to have a standard that they can point to help differentiate themselves and add trust and transparency that doesn't exist today, to help increase credibility and kind of help change the dialogue that we're having in the marketing and advertising ecosystem as it relates to how you're making those decisions about data to use.
So I know that you do something, and maybe you can help kind of dive into this. There's a ratings aspect, and there's like certification levels, and again, there might be some other parts. Can you talk about what those two things are that you provide to your clients?
Yep. So the ratings are the initial high-level, scalable, quantitative approach to making transparency of companies apparent to those that are looking for data partners. So think about it as, media buyers are out there. They're starting to do the research on where they might find and source data from. Our ratings are meant to give you that initial gut check. And so we have our standardized framework that we've published our methodology for. It's the Neutronian Quality Index. And we collect publicly available data about from a wide swath of companies. And so basically it's meant to say, are you being transparent about what you're doing and how you're doing it? Do you have, basic disclosures on your website from a privacy and compliance standpoint? Is it easy for a consumer to opt out? So there's consumer applications, there's business applications. On the business side, do you have details on your methodology and how you're creating your audiences, et cetera? So that's the ratings approach. And that's kind of, first level of defense or first level of review. And then we have our more in-depth certification akin to a financial audit. We've had folks that have gone through the process, and it is comprehensive, but it's meant to be that way because we don't want it to be surface level, so that we want it to mean something and have the credibility behind it. So that's where we engage one-on-one with partners and really get under the hood, understand how you're doing what you're doing. And at the conclusion of that, we provide our certification, which we stand behind in saying, this is a company that is meeting or exceeding industry standards or industry expectations as it pertains to data quality and transparency across the spectrum. And I guess I should also say, that framework I mentioned, the Neutronian Quality Index, we look at data across the entire life cycle. So we start with consent and compliance. How's the data collected? We move to sourcing transparency. So if there are other data assets that are incorporated in the solutions, location data, other third party, we want to understand who those are and how they're being incorporated. We look at characteristics of the data. So trying to dig into, is the data deterministic? Is it modeled? Are there considerations for fraudulent bots in traffic? There should be. And so how are you accounting for that and removing that from what you produce? We dig more into the methodology, especially if there's modeling components. We also want to understand from a processing standpoint, what infrastructure do you have in place for data security and data protection? And then we conclude with performance. So those are our 5 buckets that we dig into as part of the certification.
And I think we'll dive into some of that. But the first thing that strikes me, two things. One is that as anyone that has ever tried to work with a buyer and saying, "Hey, use our first party data," some of those questions, some of those things that you just checked off, are the questions that you get back, right? And that's the thing of the idea that you can't just create first party data and people will buy it. They're going to have questions. They're going to want to know that it's valid, and to your point about deterministic, and so forth, and like the lifespan of the data, all these
Hmm.
things become really key components of what it takes to sell data. And I think that's part of why I'm so interested in this conversation, because I think we've gone from being third party data companies that everyone kind of uses and need these checks on. You built around those. We're about to have hundreds of companies trying to get themselves into this, and there's just going to be a lot of noise, right? And a lot of like, do I trust this data source? How do I know what's going into this particular piece? So I think that part's there. The other part I'll just mention is that you use the word audit, and I had a little bit of a twinge. I don't know if you saw the little tick. Takes me all the way back to my days, early days, when buyers asked about seeing our log files and making sure even our numbers, like our user numbers, were correct, right? And I used to have to, was it? See, I kind of blanked some of that out in my mind, because
Blacked it.
like sending someone log files to check to see whether there, anything, like, I don't really want to get back to the world of an audit, and yet at the same time, I almost feel like if I'm doing a good job with my data and creating data, then I should want a stamp of approval that allows other people to kind of more transact on it more quickly and understand versus other particular things. Um, I did have one question in terms to help again draw this out a little bit further. I know based on what I've seen in your materials, you've worked or certified companies like ID5 and like Double Verify and so forth. Can you use one or both of those as examples of like ID5 to me in terms of a solution? I don't see them as a data provider. I just see them as an aspect of how data is transferred. So can you talk a little bit about that so I can understand a little bit more the nuance of what it is that you do in that certification process?
Absolutely. So the way that we talk about it too, so we've developed this framework with the intent to have it apply to a broad spectrum of data solutions. So that's why you'll see someone like an ID5, which is an identity solution, and also someone, a double verified contextual partner. We've had many audience providers, et cetera, that have gone through our process. And I think it really comes down to, we have the standard framework, but then there's customization or areas that we'll dig deeper into depending on the solution that's being offered. So obviously there's going to be different things that we would dig into specifically around identity resolution and the methodology and approach there for someone like an ID5 versus someone like a double verify. We're going to get into more details about their contextual crawler and how they're assigning contextual categories and keywords, et cetera. So we're really trying to have a standard approach, but not so rigid that it can't be modified or customized depending on the specific data offering.
Got it. Got it. That does actually help, right? And again, there's so many things that are evolving and changing, right? That I think you have to be kind of flexible on that. George, in your experience, and again, I know at one point, media buyer, you've got the kind of the
Yeah,
finance background, you help talk to publishers or whatever.
yeah,
You talk to kind of the importance of pulling all this stuff together so that again, people can make buying decisions.
yeah, absolutely. So, when I was a media buyer, the biggest challenge was attribution, really. So based on kind of where I was buying media from, the eventual kind of sale. So back in the day, you only had Google and you had Bing and you had Yahoo as essentially being, secondary sources, but the reality was Facebook was new. So, I struggled with essentially figuring out how to place media effectively for lifetime value, right, of the brand. Because the issue that media buyers still have, I think, is that you keep on acquiring the same customer over and over again. So the reason that I'm very interested in first party data, and by the way, I do believe that first party data, seller defined audiences, is something that publishers broadly can participate in. Because if you look at marketing objectives, when I was a media buyer, I would have branding objectives, but at the same time, I'd have mid funnel and then conversion. So, I think a lot of publishers may feel, because I don't have deterministic purchase data like in Amazon, I cannot participate in this world, which is not true. I think when you look at what Google, has been doing with the various kind of solutions, whether it's Flock or whatever it is now, I think they've actually shown us that there is kind of a need for first party data through the life cycle of the purchase, the purchasing journey. So kind of circling back, Rob, in terms of your question, I think media buyers are looking for new things to drive, to Lisa's point, incremental new customers for the brand, and being able to do that in a measurable way using sources outside of the traditional suspects. Because as a media buyer, that was my biggest problem. Like, I would have Google and I would have Bing, and I would have to show my clients every week, what have I done different? I'm like, I don't know. Like, I tried this different keyword. So I think having, a kind of, a robust set of options to choose from, validated and kind of, verified in a transparent manner, is critically important. Because back to Moody's and Standard & Poor's, their methodology was never public. So the fact that Neutronian has a public quantitative model with qualitative elements would have been a super helpful signal for me to have as media buyer.
Right. That makes sense. And I agree with you as well. Just, look at it this way. Once third-party cookies are gone, when to be answered, right? But there's a piece of that like, there's just going to be less signal, right, for everyone to be making decisions. And again, I think you'd back me up on this, that as a buyer, your goal is not to just to buy Google and that Bing thing you mentioned. I don't even remember what that is.
Yeah. Don't ask me when this was.
I was gonna say you definitely set me up, and I could have gone for a different joke there. But there's yes, Bing, but like, just again, the major platforms, I don't think anyone wants to just buy those. They are looking to see their ads on premium published sites, right? They know that their audience is there, and to your point, if it uncovers new people, right, that's even better, right?
Yep.
So there is an opportunity here for us to kind of create a new transaction, a new dialogue,
Yeah.
the buy side and the sell side. But I almost sit there and feel like there's a ticking time bomb of when will be the first article in Digiday or Ad Exchanger about someone through seller-defined audiences that completely was fraudulent about what it is that they set their signals to. Because SDA is not hard. It's just you as the publisher get to put in there what you want.
Yeah.
That's the part. So I love, Lisa, for you maybe to dive in a little bit about the IB Tech Lab and that relationship and how that kind of plays out.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, you hit it right on the head. I think having a standard and a mechanism to be able to be more transparent about the audiences is step one, right? And so that's what seller defined audiences does. Now, that's a basic signal telling you it's this audience. The IB Tech Lab also has the data transparency standard, which is a nutrition label for data. So for those that want to dig deeper, buyers that are looking for information, okay, we know it's audience 1, 2, 3. You can go into that repository and you can find out more details, such as where exactly was it sourced? What is the refresh cadence? What type of identifiers were used to create the audience? Was there any audience extension applied, etc. So the label then takes it one step further and gives you more transparency and information. But Rob, to your point, someone could easily see it all the way through and create what they perceive to be a high value audience and pipe that through the systems. So the IB Tech Lab has a compliance program, which is a certification and audit, and Neutronian is one of the auditors of record for that compliance program. So that's what our partnership is. And basically that looks to someone that has gone through, completed their labels, verify that they're completing the labels accurately, correctly, they have the right people and processes and technology systems in place to continue to accurately produce those labels in a way that can be depended upon. So I think it's seeing it all the way through to the certification program really gets us to where we need to be to have that trust and transparency in the ecosystem, and that backing behind it, so that there's the credibility there.
Right. So we again, people know what they're buying, then they can make those decisions based off that, and then start to see how it performs and how it works from there. One of the pieces to sell to define audiences, I don't know if you have a perspective on this, right? Again, it's recently kind of published, and something I've talked about as well is that the buy side isn't necessarily there on seller defined audiences yet, right? And from my perspective, it has been really hard to get people to necessarily experiment with things, because third-party cookies it's a junk food diet. Really hard to sit there and go like, okay, this isn't going to last. Your metabolism's going
like the McRib, right? It's like, the McRib is not good for you,
but it's out. It is time,
yeah.
and I must have it, and so forth. Right. So there's a piece of it's really hard to wean people off of that toward this better way, but without us starting to kind of test this and so forth, it's really kind of difficult. I think my question along those lines is, does the buy side look toward your audits, your certifications and so forth, to sit there and say, okay, actually I think I am ready to kind of test, right? Because you've done some of the homework that otherwise they have to do for them to even kind of conduct these kind of tests. Is that a piece of this that you're seeing, of just like how buyers are using the kind of the index that you create?
Yes. I mean, we're working on it. We're getting there. I think that we've seen, there's a broad awareness across most of the major, or all of the major agency holding companies. It varies in level degree. We actually have seen some of them on their own RFI questionnaire to ask, are you Neutronian certified, right? So we're on their radar enough that that's part of their consideration as they're evaluating data. Where we're working to get to is that we are the frontline defense, for them, so that it's kind of, okay, they have Neutronian verify against their standard, and then they can do any additional verification on top of that. I think what we need to happen to get there, and something that Neutronian's been working on, because at the end of the day, and I think, to the points earlier a little bit, when someone's making decisions about buying data, it's, you're in a marketplace, there's a lot of options out there. How do you decide what you're going to buy? It usually comes down to price and scale. And then people keep using those options if they can see an impact on performance. So something that Neutronian is trying to do is, for our partners that are going through the certification effort, also making the connection from quality to performance. And so designing performance studies that can prove out and say, if you're doing all the right things from data collection, data processing, data production standpoint, there is a direct connection to campaign performance. And I think once we have enough of those case studies and can have those proof points to point to, that's where we really crack it open and everyone says, okay, I get it. We need this. We can't just keep, buying data like stocks were bought in the 1920s before there was audited financials and just kind of going on your gut, or, going on what you've always done.
Yeah, that's the second time both of you have kind of made that kind of reference to the kind of financial situation where again, without any guardrails, right? Without there being an ability to kind of back up what it is that you're selling. We see this in CTV, right? We see a lot of investment going there, and then when you get any report related to fraud, you get really nervous really quickly. Like what exactly is kind of going on here? And yet people are buying in that particular area. And I think that there's just a piece of this of like, again, there is one aspirational piece of this, and that is that publisher first party data will perform. Right. I mean, we don't really know that until we get to the scale, until we really start to put weight on it. And that's, again, goes back to the third party cookie. I mean, again, I get the RFPs of target this gender, this age, and whatever, and I use third party data sources to do that. But I couldn't tell you what that is. And I've, again, I'm sure you've done the same thing of looking up yourself on the various sites. And
Yeah.
so some people, I'm a 90-year-old guy. Others,
Yeah.
it's like, it's kind of, it's a little bit loose on just even the third party data. Now we're sitting there trying to apply the same thing to ourselves, and it's in our best interest, I think, kind of do it, of course, right and transparently.
Yeah.
Rob,
Rob, I had one point to make on that too. The reason that I think first party data is so important is it is part of people's lives, right? Like when somebody is a human being, you do many things in a day. You may go to the Wall Street Journal, you may go to the Advocate, you may go to something else, CNN, right? So the reality is you cannot not consider somebody's life and their behavior and their interests in targeting media. That's like making a decision without having the full equation, right?
Right. I mean, again, that's the picture we've drawn, and I think there's a piece of this that we'll have to see how this plays out, right? I think the internet, and one of the first, maybe one of the original sins, right, was that we were going to get to one-to-one targeting and messaging, and kind of related to your point, right, is the fact that part of users' lives aren't really like, oh, I can't wait to see the most targeted ad to me that makes me do what X.
Yeah.
At the same time, relevant advertising totally makes sense, right?
Yeah.
And I think that's the other part, is just going to be this kind of value exchange that we have with the audiences, that we love to create this content for you. We want you to be part of that journey.
Yeah.
Just kind of referenced, but the exchange for that is going to be ads. And
Yeah.
the more if we can find that kind of that right balance, then we can do some pretty amazing things that users are going to go like, okay, I get it. Maybe not all of them, but
Yeah.
most will get the value exchange.
And the one-to-one doesn't, it's more, in my opinion, a function of kind of, time spent and how engaged somebody is with content as opposed to their actual kind of behavioral tendencies. That's my opinion. That's why you have so much engagement within kind of music streaming apps, within dating apps even. I don't know if you have an opinion on that, Lisa.
Yeah, I definitely think it's there's a value exchange and also kind of like you said, where people are spending their time. One of the things I also wanted to highlight, because I think we haven't touched on it, but it is another component of this, is reputational risk. So folks are using data. By now, I think a lot of us have seen the John Oliver clip about data brokers, right? And I think consumers are becoming more and more aware that data is being collected about them and is being leveraged. And so I think it's, now is the time to be transparent about what you're doing and how you're doing it, to avoid being one of those logos that's put up on, by John Oliver. And so I think that's also what we're aiming to do. There are people that are doing not so great things. There are people that are doing, okay, they're doing all right things, but the perception to the consumer is not that it's all right. I mean, that's the example of Jump Chat, right? Like, they weren't technically doing anything illegal, but they had an antivirus program that was collecting data and selling it, right? And so as a consumer, you're like, wait a minute, this is conflict of interest. So I think that that's also a key component here is leveraging standards like this to show and be transparent, not only in a B2B context, but a B2C context about what you're doing.
Yeah, and it's such an argument. It's such a hard argument to have with consumers, right, about this, because again, if you sat, again, it depends on what level you have the conversation, right? If you just sit there and say, do you prefer privacy over non-privacy? I mean, the answer is, I'd rather have some privacy. Thank you, right? Yeah. So there's almost like a framing of this whole thing, and again, to your point, there are some people who are doing some things that, just even trying to explain it in a way just gets you into trouble, and I think that's part of what we're always, as an industry, going to be having to deal with. But part of it is to clean up our act and then message that act, that is happening, and hold others in the ecosystem, to that standard. I think, and I think that some of the agencies have definitely done that in terms of, what they consider valid impressions and some other pieces. I have to push back as a publisher that, like, some of that stuff, how you consider an impression a valid impression, like, there's debate to be had, but I can't argue the fact that the ad should be seen by a human.
Yeah.
Right? Like there's some things that you like, well,
Yeah.
you know, you want humans to see my ad? Like, come on. Like, that seems like a high bar. It should not be a high bar. We should all be kind of working toward that. You know, some of the reaction though to all of this, you know, Apple, whether they're doing it for privacy or just kneecapping Facebook and or positioning, certainly has it in their messaging that we are all bad people. And we do now live in a cookie, you know, there are cookieless environments. And that's one thing I know that you have is like a cookieless certification. As a publisher, I can't get a dial tone on my phone without someone offering me a cookieless solution. So I'd love to understand what it is that you're actually measuring there, and you know how that again might even help me make some decisions around what kind of solutions I use.
Sure. Yep. So our cookieless verification is an added layer that we go through on top of our general certification. And something that is very apparent in the ecosystem is that the interconnectivity between all of our companies and everyone in the in the chain impacts one another. But when we're looking for that type of verification, it's for the company itself. We're verifying that third-party cookies are not part of the data collection process, and it's not part of their methodology, right? So anything in-house that they have control over, they're not relying on cookies. And so when we give that certification, it's saying they are ready now or for the future, whenever Google decides to finally cut the cord. They are not relying on cookies. And so I'm very careful in how I'm positioning that, because the reality is, even for companies that are today not relying on third-party cookies, they will pass their data downstream to a buying platform that might still be, right? And so I think that's where that's outside of your control, but you as an entity and as a business, how you're producing your solution is not dependent on cookies. So that's the signal that we're providing with that certification.
Got it. Thank you. So, you know, as I mentioned, I see more and more publishers are going to be basically data providers, right? Or again, if we're seller defined audiences takes off, it becomes something that becomes part of the bid stream. I'm sending along this information. I as a publisher, and I work with golf.com, we're not ready for an audit. Okay. Not because the data is not good. I know I'm doing it the right way, but I don't know all the things that go into going through an audit, right? And going kind of through that process. My thought, for, perhaps last piece of this kind of conversation, I'd love to kind of talk about some of the best practices that, it's almost as if I said, hey, I want to be a data provider. I'm going to start to create this whole thing. How do I get to the road of successfully getting certified? What are some of the things that might trip me up? What are the things that I'm going to have to start to get put together so that again, I'm going to be able to put that stamp and go out to market and say, look, we passed the test. We're a valid data provider. Any thoughts from both of you? Lisa, we could start with you, and George, I'd love to hear your thoughts as well.
Sure. Yep. So I think that first and foremost, I would make sure that you are up to date, have everything in place that is needed from a privacy regulation standpoint, right? So making sure you have the right disclosures, making sure, even if you're not directly collecting data from your website, that there's an easy way for consumers to opt out of data usage in collection, right? So I think there's some just basics around privacy that need to be in place. The second thing that I would say is start with being transparent. If you are collecting data and you have plans to leverage that data outside of what the privacy regulation says, but when we're talking about like the Neutronian ratings, it's all about transparency. How easy is it for us to understand what data you're collecting and how it's being used? So I would say that's kind of the entry point as you prepare for certification, is just making updates to your public facing materials that is transparent about who you are and what you're doing. I think those are the key steps in the process. The other point that I would make is, as a part of our certification, we do offer remediation. So we haven't touched on that, but if someone is like, okay, I feel like I have my ducks in a row. We get it through the certification process. We identify something that we feel should be updated in order to be up to, a certain standard. We'll provide that feedback and give you the opportunity to get there, and then continue on with the certification. So I think you want to be relatively a reasonable way down the road and have a path, towards where you're going and how you're going to be trying to monetize the data. But I did just want to point that out that, we do have ways for someone to help get to where they need to be in order to be certified.
Got it. Right. So there's a feedback loop so I can, again, got it. Right. So it's not just one test, fail, pass. It's
correct.
Here's the remediation. Here's what you need to do to kind of follow that particular piece. George, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, for sure. We're trying to be good partners, ecosystem partners. What I will emphasize, Rob, is, as a premium publisher group, there is one side of the equation, which is the buy side. What is the buy side doing? What are they prepared to ingest within systems, pipes that have existed for a long time without much modification? Separately, I did want to bring up the fact of audience extension. So that's kind of a trend that is happening. So folks releasing audience graphs, I think that's an important part of the scaling of this type of idea, because as a premium publisher, you do have a unique audience. That audience can be sold, even directly by internal sales teams via programmatic direct or, IO, if that still happens. So what I would encourage too is, as part of any audience extension effort, to be cognizant of any first party data used within that strategy. And, Lisa, you probably have an opinion here. We've talked about this before. I think it's important. And I think that audience extension, whether it's through an audience graph or something else, needs to be part of the strategy. And as a group, publishers need to be talking about that collectively. But with that comes additional kind of checks and balances that need to be put into place, correct?
100%. And actually, that's a good reminder, something that I meant to call out earlier too, as far as advice for publishers. But the same criteria that you will be evaluated against, you want to be applying to anyone that you're going to partner with, right? So you have your sacred first party data. If you're going to mix anyone in there in order to do that audience extension, you need to set the bar just as high. And that's where Neutronian can also help, is by not only helping you to achieve the certification, but by being able to help verify and validate anyone that you are considering partnering with.
You guys, everything always sets me up for things I said long ago. And this was just about like programmatic pipes. And my argument at the time, and George, with your role at Ad Lightning, I think you could appreciate this, right? Like, in one respect, it's not your partners, it's your partner's partners.
Yeah.
Right. That's where we get into trouble, right? There's so much kind of just linked to each other. And there's just the idea of even valid impressions or bots and all that kind of stuff kind of plays into that, and fraud and whatever. Now add this data layer, right? And the fact of the matter is that it's going to be publishers. They're going to be in the front line of getting consent, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
They're the ones that are actually have that relationship, and everyone else in the ecosystem will depend on them getting that consent, whether it be with an identifier, without an identifier, content, like all of that requires the publisher to go, to the user, we're transacting, we're doing something here, right? And so I think that there's like a key component to what you just said, that like, okay, great, I just did that work, I got them to say yes to advertising and to target advertising on my site, and now I'm going to work with 30 people in my header bidding stack with who knows how many companies that are on my actual page, and we're good.
Yeah.
This just isn't going to hold up over the course. It's going to need these particular pieces. And like, let's be honest, some of that's going to be the IB. TCF has been put under the microscope as to whether that's actually doing it. I think regulators are going to keep pushing the lines, right, and making it harder and harder. But the fact of the matter is that there has to be some ways for us to sit there and go, hey, as I talk to a buyer, I'm legit, and everyone behind me is legit. right? And everyone through that process. I think hopefully with all of this, there's like a flight to quality of just people who are actually doing it right. I, I'm a dreamer. What can I tell you?
Well,
There's,
small data, as opposed to infinite amounts of data, because I think we've realized that that doesn't work. If you want, 1 billion video impressions in Milwaukee, that's probably not going to happen. So, that's kind of the hope that we have. When we look at the buying community, we are seeing more popularity with PMPs. We're actually seeing PMPs beginning to transact. So the goal would be for first party data to be a huge component of that. And ultimately for publishers to benefit through CPMs finally reflecting the value
Yep.
that's provided, right?
yeah, yeah. I think on that note, like I think we're what I'm looking forward to is just further conversations about this, right? I think that there's more work to be done in terms of the overall specs to our reaction. I mean, but here's the fact: is that like publishers dealing with cookieless environments. It's good to know what's going on there. There's a lot of testing that can be done there to create those signals to open up. Again, I think, George, we're going to hold you. You spoke for all media buyers, kidding. But the idea is that you're looking for new, new members, new people to reach out to, and so if we can, as publishers, start to uncover that, I think we have a product to sell, right?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, definitely. And consider kind of co-op, types of kind of things for scale. Um, yeah, it's super interesting. We're excited to kind of watch as this evolves. And, Lisa, Tim, or Neutronian are looking to create a safe space where, we can be good ecosystem level partners.
Yeah, well, I appreciate both of you for some shedding light on what it is that Neutronian does, to talking about again some of the things that we have as challenges as we go forward in the industry, and thanks for being a part of the conversation. Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks for having us, Rob. This was fun.
Thanks, Rob. Let's do it again.
Absolutely, we'll book in with definitely again. There'll be more to talk about in the future for sure. So thanks everyone for listening in, and check and keep an eye on Beeler.Tech. Sign up for our newsletter. Make sure that you know the next Beeler.Cast that we roll out. And thanks so much for the conversation.